morning sun had barely lifted above the rolling fields when Samuel Reed first heard the faint sound echoing along the lonely country road. It was not the kind of cry that came from a child who had scraped a knee or lost a toy. No, this was different. A raw and trembling plea that carried a weight only real fear could give. The countryside was still at that hour, the kind of quiet that settles like a soft blanket over the land. But that cry tore right through it, sharp as a winter wind cutting across an open pasture. Ahead of the long line of motorcycles, the road stretched empty, framed by golden grass that swayed gently beneath the morning light. Samuel had traveled that same stretch countless times with his brothers in the Iron Legacy Brotherhood. Yet never once had he seen a figure running toward him with such desperation. A small shape, barefoot, stumbling, her pink dress stained with dried mud, her hair tangled by wind and fear. She ran as if the earth behind her was falling apart, and the only safe place left was somewhere ahead of those roaring engines. Her voice cracked as she cried out, not steady, but breaking in jagged pieces, like a fragile bell dropped on stone. The closer she came, the clearer her words became, and Samuel felt the breath catch in his chest. She kept repeating the same sentence with a trembling urgency that chilled even the toughest riders behind him. They hung my mother on a tree. The words tumbled from her small mouth in a desperate rhythm, each repetition filled with a terror no child should ever know. Samuel braked so hard his tires screamed against the pavement. Dust rose around the bike like a startled cloud. His brothers behind him slowed in a rolling echo of engines, one by one coming to a stop as they looked upon the frightened child with disbelief, and something deeper too, something only men who had lived through enough storms could recognize. A child running for her life was not a sight any of them could turn away from. The girl stood only a few steps from Samuel now, struggling to breathe, her tiny hands shaking so badly she had to press them against her chest as if holding herself together. Her cheeks were streaked with tears mixed with dirt, and her small feet were red from running over gravel and roots. Something in her eyes told Samuel she had not just witnessed fear but had been living inside it for far too long. A thin bracelet dangled from her wrist, a simple leather strap worn and faded, perhaps something precious she refused to let go of. It slapped softly against her arm each time she trembled. Samuel stepped off his bike, his boots thudding against the ground with a steady weight that seemed to calm the air around him. He approached her slowly, the way a man approaches a skittish fawn, careful not to add more fright to what was already too much for one small heart. When he knelt before her, their eyes met, and in that instant he saw the truth of her words reflected back at him. This was no misunderstanding, no childish confusion. This was a plea for help from someone who had seen a darkness that should never touch a child. Her breath hitched as she tried to speak again, her voice thin and trembling. Please help her. They hung my mom. Her body swayed as if her legs were deciding whether they could hold her any longer. Samuel reached out gently, steadying her shoulder. The warmth of his palm made her freeze for a moment, startled by a kindness she no longer expected from the world. Then she leaned into it, just slightly, as if discovering a small piece of safety she had been running toward without realizing it. Behind Samuel, the men waited in solemn silence, their usual roughness softened by the sight before them. They were bikers with steel in their hands and thunder in their engines, but their hearts were still made of flesh, and nothing cuts deeper than the cry of a child begging for someone to save her mother. And so, on that quiet country road where nothing extraordinary was ever meant to happen, destiny placed a trembling girl named Lily Porter directly in the path of a man who had long believed life had no more room left for miracles. He did not know it then, but the moment he lifted her into his arms, the story of all three lives began to change. Samuel lifted the trembling girl into his arms with the same gentleness a man uses when handling something precious, something he fears might break if he breathes too hard. Lily Porter weighed almost nothing, yet the fear clinging to her small body made her feel heavier than any burden Samuel had carried in years. Her fingers clutched the collar of his worn denim vest as if she believed he might disappear if she loosened her grip. He held her close, steady as an old oak that had weathered many storms. Behind him, the long column of riders waited, engines humming in a low rumble that rolled across the quiet fields like distant thunder. These men were known throughout the region as the Iron Legacy Brotherhood, a name whispered with both respect and curiosity. To outsiders they looked intimidating, wrapped in leather and steel. But within the circle of riders lived a loyalty deeper than many families ever knew. They followed Samuel Reed not because he was the biggest or the loudest, but because he carried a kind of steadiness that gave troubled souls a reason to trust him. As Samuel steadied Lily on the front of his bike, the men watched in silence. No orders had been given. None were required. A child in danger was enough to shift the entire group into a different kind of formation, the kind they used not in celebration, but in protection. Samuel adjusted his gloves, then glanced over his shoulder at the brothers who had ridden beside him through countless miles of hardship. "We follow your lead, Sam," one rider murmured from behind his dark visor. The others nodded, in quiet unity. Lily pointed toward the dense wall of forest that grew thick along the edges of the road. Her hand shook so badly she could scarcely direct them, but Samuel understood the urgency in her eyes. Whatever nightmare she had escaped was still hiding somewhere beneath those branches. The forest, once just a peaceful stretch of green, took on a new heaviness, as though it held secrets no sunlight dared touch. Samuel gave a soft nod, and without a word, he turned his bike toward the tree line. The crunch of gravel under the tires signaled the beginning of a journey none of them had planned to take that morning. The line of riders shifted behind him, falling into formation with a natural grace that only years of riding together could create. As they approached the edge of the woods, the air seemed to change. The warm breeze cooled, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and old leaves. Birds that had been chirping moments earlier went silent, as if sensing the danger hidden deeper inside. Lily pressed her cheek against Samuel's chest, trying to draw comfort from his steady heartbeat. Her breath came in shaky bursts, but she no longer felt alone on that long stretch of road. Samuel rested a reassuring hand over hers. He did not speak because words often felt too small during moments like this. Instead, he let his actions speak for him, as they always had. He leaned forward, revved the engine gently, and allowed the bike to roll past the first curtain of branches. The others followed, their boots brushing against ferns and broken twigs. For a brief moment, Samuel looked at the sky, as if asking silently for the strength he knew he would need. Then he focused once more on the trail ahead. Whatever lay hidden in those woods had hurt this child and her mother deeply. And Samuel Reed, a man who once believed his heart had dried up like old timber, felt something stir inside him. A quiet promise, steady as his breath. Not today. Not while he still had strength in his hands and brothers at his side. The deeper they eased into the forest, the more Samuel could feel Lily's exhaustion settling through her small frame. It was not the gentle tiredness of a child after a long day of play, but the kind that comes from running with fear snapping at one's heels. Her breaths arrived in short, uneven bursts, each one sounding like it cost her more strength than she could spare. The mud on her pink dress had dried into stiff patches, and the fabric clung to her like a reminder of the long night she had endured alone. Samuel slowed the bike to a near crawl, allowing the rest of the riders to spread out behind him as they navigated the tight trail. Overhead, branches arched like old cathedral beams, filtering the sunlight into soft ribbons that fell across Lily's trembling shoulders. Her bare feet rested gingerly on the metal frame, scraped and reddened from miles of unforgiving ground. She winced every time the bike jostled over a root, but she held on to Samuel with all the strength she had left. He felt her press closer, seeking something solid in a world that had become frighteningly uncertain. Her small hand clung to the front of his vest, her fingers curling tightly around a decorative patch stitched onto the leather. It was the emblem of the Brotherhood, a pair of wings encircling an iron wheel, but somehow Lily held it as though it were a lifeline. Samuel wondered how long she had been running before she found the courage to step into the middle of the road, hoping a stranger might offer the safety she desperately needed. Ethan Cole, the youngest rider in the group, rolled up alongside Samuel for a moment. His helmet hid most of his expression, but Samuel could see the worry in the angle of his shoulders. That kid had a heart too big for his own good. "You think she ran all night, Sam?" His voice was quiet, touched with disbelief. Samuel nodded slowly. "Looks that way. Fear keeps small legs moving farther than you'd imagine." Ethan swallowed hard and drifted back into formation, shaken by the thought. Lily shifted again, her breath hitching as though she were trying to keep a sob from escaping. Samuel lowered one hand to rest gently over her forearm. "You're safe now, sweetheart. We've got you." The words were soft, barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of a promise he intended to keep. Her response was a small nod, followed by a trembling exhale. She lifted her head just enough for Samuel to see her face in the dappled light. Dirt streaked across her cheeks, tangled with the dried path her tears had carved earlier. Her eyes were red and swollen, yet behind all that pain flickered something fragile: hope, the kind that dared to return gingerly, testing the air like a timid bird. From her other hand dangled a small wooden charm, tied to a thin leather cord. Samuel recognized it as an old keepsake, the type a parent might carve for a child. A tiny star, worn smooth by years of being held during moments of fear or comfort. Lily tightened her grip around it with a familiarity that spoke of its importance. The sight pressed a hard ache into Samuel's chest. He had once carried something similar in his pocket when his own daughter was young, a small reminder of the moments that now lived only in memory. Seeing Lily clutch her star made the old ache rise again, tender and unexpected. As the forest grew denser and the air heavier, Samuel felt the urgency in the girl's body sharpen once more. She straightened, pointing shakily toward a narrow path barely visible beneath thick ferns. Her voice wavered. "That way." Samuel leaned forward, tightened his grip on the handlebars, and guided the bike toward the direction she indicated. Behind him, the Iron Legacy Brotherhood followed like a moving wall of protection. Lily had reached the end of her strength. Now it was their turn to carry her the rest of the way. As Samuel guided the bike deeper into the forest, he began to notice details he had missed in the chaos of those first moments. Now that Lily was close enough for him to feel each trembling breath against his chest, the truth of what she had endured settled over him like a cold shadow. The marks on her wrists were the first things that caught his eye. Faint, reddish grooves ran around the delicate skin, the kind left by coarse rope pulled far too tight. A child her size had no reason to bear wounds like that. He felt a slow, controlled anger rise inside him, the kind that does not roar but burns steady and deep. It was the same sensation he once felt during his years in uniform, when he arrived too late to prevent a family from being torn apart by violence. Those memories had grown dusty with time, but seeing Lily's injured wrists stirred them awake with painful clarity. Her breathing remained unsteady, catching now and then as though she were remembering pieces of the night she had fled. Samuel noticed the way her eyes flicked sharply toward every sound: a snapping twig, a bird taking flight, even the distant groan of a shifting branch. Each one made her shoulders tighten, her small frame stiffening as if bracing for someone to leap out from behind the trees. Children did not learn that kind of vigilance, unless fear had been their companion for too long. Ethan, riding just behind them, called out softly, "Sam, look at her hands." Samuel had already seen them. Lily's fingers were scraped raw, dirt packed beneath her nails from clawing at something, perhaps the wall she squeezed through to escape. She had fought for her freedom with everything she had, and her tiny hands carried the evidence. The older riders exchanged looks heavy with realization. Grown men who had once faced dangers across highways and battlefields suddenly felt an ache settle in their chests at the sight of a child forced to run for her life. One of the riders, a man named Rowdy Briggs who rarely spoke without a laugh, removed his helmet long enough to wipe his eyes. "Poor little thing," he muttered, voice hushed with sorrow. Lily must have sensed their quiet sympathy, for she shifted slightly, as if embarrassed by their concern. Samuel lowered his head, speaking gently so only she could hear. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. None of this is your fault." His voice carried that steady warmth she had begun to lean toward, the kind of tone a child recognizes even when spoken by someone they've just met. She nodded, though she kept her gaze fixed ahead, as if afraid that looking back might summon the figures she had escaped. A thin trail of dried blood traced along her forearm, not from a deep wound, but from scratches and tears likely caused by thorns. Samuel wondered how long she had pushed through the dark woods, stumbling over roots and stones, determined to reach anyone who might listen. He felt his jaw tighten. No child should ever be forced to prove her bravery in such a way. Sunlight slipped through the branches in soft, trembling patches, catching the fear in Lily's eyes like reflections on water. She flinched each time the bike dipped, but she never let go of Samuel's vest. That grip told him more than her words ever could. Somewhere in the chaos of her escape, she had chosen him as the person she believed could keep her safe. He placed a reassuring hand over hers once again. "You're with us now, Lily. Nothing out here is going to hurt you anymore." She did not answer, but her shoulders settled just a little, as though trusting the strength in his voice. The forest ahead grew darker, its silence heavy and expectant. Samuel knew they were drawing closer to whatever horror this child had witnessed, and whatever waited ahead, he would face it head-on, because the fear carved onto Lily Porter's small hands and frightened eyes deserved justice. The trail Lily pointed toward was barely more than a whisper in the undergrowth, a thin line pressed into the earth by deer hooves and time. If not for her trembling hand guiding them, Samuel might have ridden past it without ever noticing. The path looked as though the forest itself was trying to hide it, draping thick curtains of fern and wild vine across the entrance, as if protecting whatever truth lay inside. Samuel eased the bike forward, his hands steady on the handlebars as Lily sat perched in front of him. She was so small that the rise and fall of his breathing seemed to lift her gently with each inhale. The other riders fanned out behind him, their engines lowered to a soft hum that blended with the quiet pulse of the woods. The deeper they went, the more the world outside seemed to fade, replaced by a hushed stillness that felt old and watchful. The forest floor grew uneven, roots twisting like weathered ropes beneath the fallen leaves. Each time the bike rolled over one, Lily tightened her hold on Samuel's vest, drawing herself closer in search of the steadiness his presence offered. Samuel leaned forward slightly, shielding her from branches that dipped low enough to brush her tangled hair. He spoke in a calm murmur, telling her that she was doing well, that she was brave, and that they were right behind her for every step she could no longer take alone. Behind him, Ethan Cole maneuvered carefully, keeping a protective distance. He called out softly to warn the others of obstacles in the trail, his voice low and respectful, never wanting to startle Lily. The Brotherhood moved like a single body, each rider attuned to the presence of the child at their center. Men who spent most of their days roaring down highways with steel in their hands now rode with the tenderness of fathers guiding a sleeping infant. The air grew cooler as they traveled deeper. Moss climbed the trunks of old trees, and shafts of sunlight flickered through the branches in pale, trembling beams. A thin mist hung low to the ground, swirling around the bikes as though stirred by invisible fingers. Lily lifted her head once to look around, her eyes tracing the shadows between the oaks. She seemed to know precisely where to go, even though the trail twisted and narrowed as if trying to throw her off. Samuel sensed the moment memories returned to her. Her breath hitched, and her body tensed, and she raised one hand toward a deeper pocket of the forest. She did not speak, but the message was clear. This was the direction. This was where the fear had followed her from. Samuel nodded, his voice a low reassurance that they were close and that she would not face it alone. The trail dipped into a shallow hollow, the earth soft and damp beneath the bikes. Branches closed in tighter here, forming a dim corridor that smelled of pine and old rain. The riders slowed even more, their boots brushing the leaves as they balanced the weight of their machines. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, its cry sharp enough to make Lily flinch. Samuel placed a comforting hand on her small shoulder, steadying the storm rising inside her. For a moment, the group paused. The forest pressed around them, heavy with expectation. Samuel could feel the shift, the sense that they were crossing into the heart of the story Lily had carried in her fragile chest. Her breathing grew shallow again, and she looked up at him with wide eyes filled with both fear and trust. He gave her a small nod and guided the bike forward. Whatever waited beyond the next bend, they would face it together. She had led them with the last of her strength, and now it was time for the Brotherhood to follow through on the silent promise they had made the moment she stepped into their path. The narrow trail opened suddenly into a small clearing, as though the forest had pulled its arms back just enough to reveal a hidden wound. The air felt different here, colder and strangely still, as if even the wind refused to disturb the sorrow resting beneath the towering oak at the center. Samuel slowed the bike until it rolled to a gentle stop, his breath pressing tight against his ribs as he sensed the weight of what lay ahead. Lily lifted her head, her eyes widening with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. Samuel could feel her small body stiffen, a quiet tremor running through her like a whisper of the fear that had chased her all night. She raised a shaking hand toward the base of the massive tree, and Samuel followed her gaze. There, suspended from a rough length of rope looped over a thick branch, hung a woman. Her figure swayed ever so slightly in the faint breeze. The edges of her dress were torn, her hair tangled and matted by dirt and fear. Her head drooped forward as though sleep had pulled her under. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Not a single rider dared to break the silence surrounding that terrible sight. Samuel felt the breath leave him in a slow, aching exhale. The woman was Margaret Porter, the mother Lily had been running herself ragged to save. Even from where he stood, he could see the bruises along her arms, the raw marks on her wrists, the unnatural bend of her posture. Her feet touched the ground only lightly, her weight still carried by the cruel rope cutting into her skin. Lily released a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and Samuel felt her collapse against him, as though her strength had finally reached its last thread. He lifted her gently, stepping off the bike while signaling the rest of the Brotherhood to move forward. Ethan was the first to reach the tree, his hands trembling as he examined the knot that held Margaret aloft. Behind him, two other riders quickly positioned themselves to support her weight. Samuel approached with measured steps, cradling Lily close. He could feel her heart racing, the frantic rhythm echoing against his chest. When he knelt beside the tree, he spoke her mother's name in a quiet breath, not as a shout but as a plea for her to hold on just a little longer. The men worked swiftly and carefully. One man steadied Margaret's limp form while another sawed at the rope with a pocket blade. The rope snapped with a harsh twang, and Margaret fell gently into Samuel's waiting arms. Her body was limp, fragile as a wilted flower crushed by frost. Samuel lowered her onto a patch of soft moss, brushing leaves away from her face. Her lips were pale, her cheeks streaked with dirt, and her pulse so faint he had to hold his breath to feel it. Yet it was there, a thin thread of life refusing to break. Lily slipped from his embrace and crawled to her mother's side. Her tiny hands trembled as she reached for Margaret's fingers. The moment their hands touched, Lily released a sob that seemed to carry every fear, every mile she had run, every moment she had thought she might lose the woman who raised her. Margaret did not wake, but a faint quiver crossed her lips as if she recognized the warmth of her child. The Brotherhood formed a quiet circle around them, men who had faced storms and violence now standing with hats lowered, humbled by the sight of a child clinging to a mother torn yet still alive. The forest watched in silence, the oak towering above them like a witness carved by time. Samuel felt something shift deep within his spirit, a familiar ache stirring from a place he rarely allowed himself to visit. He remembered another child, another moment when life had slipped beyond his reach. But not today. Not this time. He looked at Margaret, then at Lily, and made a promise in the quiet of his heart. They would not lose each other, not while he still breathed. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the men worked around Margaret's fragile body. The rope lay curled beside her like a shed skin, a hollow reminder of the danger she had survived. Samuel knelt in the soft earth, listening carefully for every faint rise of her chest. Each breath was shallow, uncertain, yet present enough to kindle a small but growing hope. Lily remained beside her mother, one hand resting on Margaret's arm as if her touch alone might anchor her to the world. Ethan hurried back from his bike with a compact medical pouch slung across his shoulder. Years of riding alongside Samuel had taught him more about emergency care than he ever expected to know. He set the kit down gently, his movements calm and deliberate. Determined not to frighten Lily further, the other riders created a protective ring around the clearing, standing like quiet sentinels beneath the towering branches. Their presence was steady and unwavering, forming a barrier of human strength between the family and whatever might still linger in the forest shadows. Samuel guided Lily a few inches to the side so he could examine Margaret more closely. He checked the bruises along her neck, the swelling around her wrists, the faint but steady pulse that flickered beneath his fingertips. Relief slipped through him like warmth returning to chilled skin. She was holding on. She just needed time, safety, and gentle care. Ethan unfolded a clean cloth and dampened it with water from his canteen. He handed it to Samuel, who began wiping the dirt from Margaret's face with slow, careful strokes. Her eyelids fluttered for a brief moment, then settled again. The simple act of cleaning her wounds felt sacred, as though kindness itself was stitching the first threads of healing. Another rider, a broad man named Mason Holt, arrived with blankets taken from his saddlebag. He draped one across Margaret's body, tucking it close to shield her from the cold seeping through the forest floor. Mason then handed a second blanket to Lily, who hesitated before wrapping it around her small shoulders. The warmth made her shiver, not from cold but from the release of tension she had carried since the night began. The men kept their voices low as they worked. No one barked orders or rushed decisions. They moved with a unity shaped by years of riding together, guided by a silent understanding that this moment demanded gentleness more than power. A few riders swept the perimeter, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Others retrieved water, spare jackets, whatever might help the shaken family before them. Samuel leaned back slightly, giving Lily room to nestle beside her mother again. The child rested her head near Margaret's shoulder, her small fingers tracing lightly along the blanket. A faint hum rose from her, a soothing rhythm she must have learned from Margaret herself. The sound carried through the clearing, soft as a lullaby, grounding everyone who heard it. In the dim light filtering through the branches, Samuel met the eyes of his brothers. He saw the same mix of resolve and compassion reflected back at him. These were men who had ridden through storms, who had known loss, who understood that protecting the vulnerable was not a burden but a calling woven into their bones. They would stand guard here until Margaret could be moved. They would shield Lily from further harm, and they would not let the darkness that had chased her through the night reclaim what she had fought so hard to save. Samuel placed a steady hand on Lily's shoulder. She looked up at him with eyes still wet from fear, yet now carrying a fragile trust. He offered her a small nod, the kind that carried reassurance without a single spoken word. The clearing felt different now. Where fear had lived moments earlier, a quiet strength began to take root. As the men held their quiet vigil around the clearing, Samuel noticed the way Lily's small body shook despite the blanket draped around her shoulders. She sat close to her mother, fingers woven into the fabric that covered Margaret, as though afraid that letting go might cause her to fade like morning mist. Her eyes were distant, fixed on a place far beyond the forest, somewhere deep in the memory she had fought so hard to outrun. Samuel settled beside her, his movements slow and gentle. He did not press her with questions. Children who had lived through terror often needed time to find their voice again. Instead, he waited, giving her that space, trusting that when her heart was ready, she would share what weighed on her. Lily shifted, drawing her knees to her chest. The faintest tremor traveled through her hands. For a long moment she simply stared at the roots curling beneath the oak tree, letting the silence wrap around her like a fragile cocoon. Then, almost in a whisper, Words began to form. She spoke of the night before, when the world still felt ordinary. She had been helping her mother tidy their small cabin, brushing wood shavings from the old workbench Margaret used for her craft. Margaret had been shaping a piece of oak, smoothing it with practiced strokes, humming the gentle tune she always turned to when the day grew long. Lily described the warmth of that moment, the simple peace of a home built from love and routine. Then the peace shattered. 3 men forced their way through the door, their boots trampling across the wooden floor. Lily described them as shadows at first, tall shapes with harsh voices that filled the small cabin like thunder. They accused Margaret of knowing something, of speaking to someone she had never heard of, demanding answers she did not possess. The more Margaret insisted she did not understand, the more agitated the intruders became. Lily paused, swallowing hard. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She continued, explaining how the men tore through the cabin, scattering drawers, breaking shelves, searching for something unnamed. Margaret tried to shield Lily, keeping her behind her as long as she could, but one of the men pushed them apart and bound their wrists with coarse rope. Fear had taken hold then, the kind that squeezes breath from the lungs. The men dragged Margaret toward the door while another kept Lily pinned to the floor. Lily's voice wavered when she recounted the look in her mother's eyes, a silent plea urging her to stay strong. The cabin door slammed shut, leaving her alone with nothing but the echo of Margaret's fading cries. She spoke of the loose board near the back wall, the one she and Margaret had never repaired. Her small hands had worked desperately to widen the gap, scraping her skin against the wood until pain blurred into determination. Through the opening she slipped, stumbling into the cold night, the forest welcoming her with darkness and tangled roots. She ran. She tripped. She crawled when her legs refused to carry her. And all the while she screamed for help, each call shredding her throat until her voice trembled with fatigue. She had no sense of direction, only the belief that someone had to hear her. Hours passed as she pushed through the trees, guided by nothing more than instinct and hope. Then, as dawn began to wear its soft colors across the sky, she heard the distant thunder of engines. For a moment she believed she was imagining it, another sound conjured by fear. But when the roar grew louder, she gathered the last of her strength and ran toward it. Her voice fell silent then. She leaned into Samuel's side, exhaustion pulling at her slender frame. Samuel placed a steady hand on her back, a gesture of comfort offered without a single spoken word. Around them, the riders bowed their heads in quiet reverence. What Lily had survived required more courage than many grown men could muster. She had carried her fear alone through the night. Now, she would never carry it alone again. When Lily's story reached its quiet end, the clearing grew so still that even the birds seemed to pause in solemn respect. Samuel remained beside her, his hand resting lightly along her small back, grounding her trembling spirit with a presence as steady as the earth beneath them. For a long moment he simply breathed, letting the weight of her words settle deep into the places inside him he rarely allowed anyone to see. He had listened to many stories in his lifetime, tales carried by wandering souls who found their way to the Brotherhood, seeking refuge or redemption. Yet none had pierced him quite like this one. Watching Lily curl close to her unconscious mother, he felt a familiar ache stir beneath his ribs, a reminder of the daughter he once held in his arms before illness carried her beyond his reach. That sorrow had hardened him in ways he never spoke of, leaving him convinced that no new light could enter the spaces where loss had taken root. But seeing Lily fight so fiercely for the woman lying beside her awakened something Samuel thought he had buried long ago. The courage of a child was a powerful thing. It had a way of calling forth promises that rose from the deepest parts of a person's heart. He looked around the clearing, scanning the trees as though expecting danger to step forward from the shadows. He knew nothing of the men who had stormed the cabin. He did not know their names or their reasons. Details did not matter. What mattered was the fear in Lily's voice and the bruises across Margaret's fragile body. Whoever had done this still walked free somewhere beyond the tree line. Ethan approached quietly, his boots moving lightly across the thick carpet of fallen leaves. He stopped beside Samuel, eyes filled with a question he did not need to speak aloud. Samuel understood it all the same. This was no ordinary rescue. It carried a weight that demanded more than a single act of kindness. It required a commitment, one that might stretch far beyond this forest clearing. Samuel rose to his feet with a slow, deliberate motion, as though anchoring himself into the soil before making a vow he would not break. He surveyed the circle of riders standing guard, men bound not by blood but by decades of shared roads and weathered battles. Their faces carried the same expression, quiet determination, the kind that comes when a wrong has been witnessed and justice demands a response. He turned his gaze back to Lily, who watched him with wide, fearful eyes. His voice, though gentle, carried the weight of a promise formed in the marrow of his bones. She was safe now. Her mother was safe. He would not allow darkness to return for them. Whatever threat lay beyond the forest, whatever shadow lingered in the corners of the night, he would face it head on. The Brotherhood shifted closer, as if drawn by the silent vow passing through the air. Mason adjusted his stance, scanning the edges of the clearing with a renewed sense of purpose. Rowdy rested a hand on the handle of his worn tool belt, ready to assist however needed. Ethan placed a reassuring palm on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture that spoke more deeply than any words. Lily leaned against her mother, her eyes drifting closed for the first time since dawn. There was a small change in her expression, a softness born not of relief but of trust. The kind of trust only a child could give so freely once she believed she was truly protected. Samuel settled beside her again, letting the forest silence wrap around them. The world had taken enough from this child. It would not take more. In that quiet clearing, beneath the sheltering branches of an ancient oak, Samuel Reed decided that Lily and Margaret Porter were now under his care. And once a man like Samuel made such a decision, nothing in heaven or on earth could turn him away from it. The journey out of the forest unfolded with a quiet urgency, every movement shaped by the determination of men who refused to leave a wounded family behind. Samuel lifted Margaret carefully, cradling her as though she were made of fragile glass. Her weight rested lightly in his arms, yet the responsibility of carrying her felt immense. Lily walked close beside him, her hand gripping the hem of his vest with the fragile trust of a child clinging to the single steady thing left in her world. Ethan and Mason cleared the narrow trail ahead, moving fallen branches aside to create a smooth path for Samuel. The other riders formed a protective ring behind them, their boots pressing into the damp earth with purposeful strides. No one spoke. The forest still carried echoes of the shadows that had harmed this family, and silence felt like the safest companion as they made their way back toward the road. When the first sliver of open sky appeared through the trees, Lily released a trembling breath, as though emerging from a long night into the possibility of morning. Samuel offered her a reassuring glance, and she responded with a small nod, her expression a mix of exhaustion and fragile resilience. Reaching the line of parked motorcycles, the men moved with practiced coordination. Mason secured a makeshift carrier on the back of his bike, layering blankets to cushion Margaret during the ride. Samuel settled her gently, adjusting the covers to shield her from the breeze. Lily climbed onto Samuel's bike, her small frame pressing close to him for both warmth and comfort. When the engine started, the sound rose in a solemn chorus, not loud or wild, but steady and protective. The ride to town felt longer than usual, though the miles passed beneath them with unwavering purpose. The early afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the fields. Lily held tightly to Samuel, her cheek resting against the faded leather of his vest, her breathing steadying with each mile that carried her further from the fear-filled cabin. Behind them, the Brotherhood rode in a tight formation, their presence forming a shield of chrome and resolve around the injured woman at the heart of the group. At the small-town clinic, nurses rushed from the doorway as soon as the riders arrived. Margaret was carried inside with gentle hands, passed from the Brotherhood to the medical team like a precious object that could not afford to be dropped. Lily followed close enough to feel Samuel's steady steps beside her. Even within the bright hallway of the clinic, She refused to release his hand. While the doctors worked behind closed doors, Samuel sat in one of the wooden chairs in the waiting area. Lily curled against him like a frightened sparrow seeking shelter beneath a sturdy branch. He draped his coat around her shoulders, offering warmth she had not felt in many long hours. Her breathing eventually settled into a light, tired rhythm, her forehead resting against his arm. Outside, the Brotherhood remained stationed around the clinic. Their bikes stood in silent rows, engines cooling in the evening air. The men took shifts watching the doors, their presence a clear message to anyone who might think of returning to finish what had been started. As the last rays of daylight faded, lanterns were placed near the entrance, casting a warm glow across the gravel lot. Inside, the hours crept by. Samuel did not move from his seat, even as the hard wood pressed into his back. Lily needed stability, and he intended to give it without hesitation. Occasionally, Ethan peeked through the door, offering a nod to assure Samuel that everything outside remained secure. When the doctor finally emerged from the treatment room, his face showed exhaustion tempered by relief. Margaret was alive. Weak, injured, but alive. Those words allowed a quiet wave of hope to fill the waiting room. Lily cried softly, not from fear this time, but from the sudden release of the weight she had carried alone through the dark woods. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer of gratitude. The night had not ended yet, but the darkest part of it had finally passed. The waiting room settled into a deep stillness once the doctor returned to his duties. The soft hum of overhead lights mingled with the distant clatter of medical trays, forming a quiet rhythm that filled the long evening hours. Samuel remained seated in the same wooden chair, his back straight, his presence steady as the roots of an old maple tree. Lily nestled close to him, her head pressed against his arm as though it were the only anchor preventing her from drifting into fear again. She clung to him with a tenderness that reached beyond simple gratitude. It was the instinct of a child who had endured too much, and finally found a place where the storm could not reach her. Her fingers curled around the fabric of his shirt, small and trembling yet determined to hold on. Samuel rested one large hand on her shoulder, letting his warmth calm the shivers that still rippled through her slender frame. The air carried the faint scent of antiseptic, blending with the creak of the old floorboards whenever a nurse passed by. Outside the wide window, night draped itself over the town like a dark quilt, the street lamps glowing softly along the quiet road. The Brotherhood remained stationed beyond the glass, their silhouettes steady under the lights, each man keeping watch with the unwavering resolve of someone who understood the importance of a promise. From time to time, Lily shifted, lifting her head just enough to steal a glance at the closed door that separated her from her mother. Each glance carried a flutter of hope mixed with fear. When she felt her courage falter, she tucked herself closer to Samuel again, drawing comfort from the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Samuel remembered holding his own daughter like this long ago, offering her safety after nightmares or storms that rattled the walls of their home. That memory rose gently, not as a wound, but as a reminder of the tenderness he once believed he had lost forever. Now, with Lily leaning against him, that tenderness stirred again, warm and unwavering. Ethan stepped inside briefly, his boots echoing softly across the tile floor. He offered Samuel a quiet nod, then knelt beside Lily with a gentle smile. He told her in a calm tone that the riders were taking shifts outside, making sure no harm came near the clinic. Lily listened without lifting her eyes, but the slight relaxation in her shoulders showed she believed him. When Ethan returned to the door, Samuel placed a grateful hand on his arm before he slipped out again. A nurse approached with a cup of warm tea, setting it beside Samuel with a soft smile. She looked at Lily with a tenderness that only a woman accustomed to healing could possess. She assured Samuel that Margaret was receiving attentive care, then returned to her duties, leaving the warm cup steaming on the small table. Time passed in gentle waves. Lily's breathing grew slower, heavy with exhaustion. Though fear still hovered at the edges of her expression, the exhaustion softened her features, loosening the tension around her eyes. Samuel shifted slightly, creating a more comfortable space for her to rest. Her head dropped softly against his chest, and for the first time since he had met her on the lonely road, she drifted into a fragile sleep. Samuel looked down at her, struck by the quiet strength hidden in such a small body. The child had run through the forest alone, fought against terror, and clung to hope with every breath. Her courage humbled him. He wrapped his coat more securely around her, shielding her from the cool air seeping through the old windows. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but Samuel was prepared to sit through every hour. He would not move. He would not rest. His presence was the promise she depended on, and he intended to uphold it with the same steadfast loyalty he offered his brothers on the road. In the soft glow of the waiting room light, with Lily sleeping safely against him, Samuel felt a quiet stirring of something he had not felt in years, a purpose strong enough to silence the loneliness that had trailed him through countless miles. The night no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of something he had never expected to find again. Morning arrived gently over the town, carrying a pale golden light that stretched across the quiet streets. When the doctor allowed Samuel to take Lily home to rest, the Brotherhood did not return to their usual routines. Instead, they turned their attention to the small cabin hidden deep within the forest, the place where fear had entered the lives of Margaret and her daughter. They approached it not as visitors, but as men determined to give the family a fresh beginning. The cabin looked worn and shaken, as though the night's terror had seeped into the wood itself. Shattered glass rested in the garden like scattered frost. A broken shutter hung crookedly beside the window frame. The marks of violent hands remained across the doorway, calling silently for repair. Ethan stood in the center of the yard, surveying the damage with a sober expression. He remarked quietly that no child should ever come home to a place that felt unsafe. Samuel agreed with a slow nod. He knew that healing required more than medical care. It needed surroundings that held warmth, stability, and a sense of being sheltered from the world's harsher winds. With that in mind, he directed the men into action. Mason and Rowdy started with the windows, removing the shattered panes and fitting new glass with careful precision. They reinforced the frames, making sure each corner was snug and sturdy. Another group repaired the door, sanding the scarred wood and fastening new hinges that allowed it to swing smoothly, free from the harsh memories that had weakened the original structure. Inside, the riders cleaned every inch of the cabin. Dust, splinters, and broken fragments were swept away. Shelves were fixed, drawers were replaced, and the familiar scent of fresh timber soon drifted through the rooms. Someone found Margaret's woodworking tools tucked beneath a fallen shelf and set them neatly on the workbench. The small wooden stars she had been carving for Lily were gathered carefully and arranged as though awaiting her return. Ethan rode to town and came back with bags of groceries, blankets, lanterns, and simple comforts that could help turn a shaken house into a welcoming home again. He placed the food in the pantry, folded the blankets with surprising care, and even arranged a vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table. The soft colors added warmth to the room, a gentle reminder that quiet beauty could still be found after a night of fear. Outdoors, Samuel oversaw the installation of motion lights along the cabin's perimeter. They glowed softly when someone approached, offering a sense of security to anyone inside. Cameras were mounted beneath the eaves, their lenses facing the paths that wound through the towering pines. 2 riders volunteered to patrol the area each night for the next several weeks, a duty they accepted with pride. No threat would cross those woods again without meeting the watchful eyes of the Brotherhood. As the day wore on, the cabin transformed. What had been a place marked by violence now stood renewed, carrying a sense of strength that mirrored the solidarity of the men repairing it. Samuel walked through the doorway when everything was nearly finished, his boots thudding softly on the restored floorboards. He pictured Margaret waking here one day soon, resting her eyes on the peaceful corners of her home, finding calm where fear once lived. Outside, Lily and Mrs. Delaney from the nearby farm arrived to see the progress. The elderly woman placed a gentle hand on Lily's back, whispering that the forest was full of good people too, not just the shadows she remembered. Lily looked around at the riders, her gaze lingering on Samuel with a mixture of awe and gratitude. She saw her home restored, the spaces once broken now mended with care beyond anything she had expected. Samuel stepped beside her, giving her a quiet nod. This house would no longer echo with fear. It would hold safety, warmth, and the steady watch of people who had taken her and her mother into their hearts. By the time evening settled over the treetops, the cabin glowed softly beneath the porch light, ready to welcome its family back. When Margaret was finally strong enough to return home, the forest welcomed her with a stillness so gentle it seemed to bow in respect. The cabin, freshly mended and glowing beneath the soft afternoon light, stood as a quiet promise of safety. Lily walked beside Samuel, her steps no longer hesitant but light and curious, like those of a child rediscovering her place in the world. She kept close to him, glancing up at his calm expression as though searching for reassurance that everything would truly be different now. Inside the cabin, Margaret moved slowly, supported by Mrs. Delaney and a pair of nurses who had insisted on accompanying her. Though weak, she held steady, her eyes drifting across the repaired walls and polished floors with gratitude that deepened the faint smile resting on her lips. Lily stayed near Samuel, explaining each improvement with a sense of pride, telling him how she could not believe the house looked just like it did before, maybe even better. Samuel listened without interruption, nodding with the gentle patience of someone who understood how meaningful such small observations were. The days that followed carried a peace that felt both new and familiar. Lily began to rediscover the rhythm of childhood, running barefoot across the soft grass behind the cabin, chasing dandelion seeds that floated on the breeze. When shadows rustled through the trees, she no longer jumped in fear. Instead, she would search for Samuel, often finding him repairing a fence post or checking the motion lights. She would slip her hand into his without a word, her small fingers wrapping around his calloused ones in quiet trust. Samuel never pulled away. He let her lead him to the creek nearby, where she showed him smooth stones shaped by years of flowing water. She laughed softly, a sound he had not heard from her before, and it rose through the air like birdsong after a long winter. Each time she smiled, something warm stirred in Samuel's chest, a gentle reminder that life still held room for new bonds, even after old wounds had settled deep. Ethan often joined them, pretending not to watch Samuel closely. He had noticed the change, too. The man who once kept his heart tucked behind walls of solitude now walked through the forest with a quiet ease, carrying Lily on his shoulders, or listening to her stories with genuine interest. The Brotherhood saw it as well. They teased him lightly, calling Lily his shadow, though they did so with fondness rather than jest. One afternoon, Lily surprised Samuel with a small wooden star she had found among her mother's unfinished crafts. She offered it to him with both hands, explaining that her mother used to make them whenever life felt heavy. Samuel accepted it slowly, turning the smooth shape between his fingers. The gesture touched something deep within him. It felt like a bridge forming between his past losses and the new purpose growing in his life. Margaret, watching from the porch, noticed the unspoken bond forming between them. She understood the depth of what Samuel had given her family, not only safety but the steady tenderness Lily needed to reclaim her innocence. Though Margaret was still recovering, she felt comforted knowing her daughter had found a guardian who carried kindness as naturally as others carried strength. Evenings often ended with Lily sitting beside Samuel on the porch steps. They watched the fireflies drift through the approaching twilight, tiny lights weaving patterns through the dusk. Lily leaned against him, tired from the day, but peaceful in a way she had not felt for a long time. Samuel rested a hand lightly on her shoulder, steady as always. In those quiet moments, surrounded by the softened glow of the setting sun, the forest no longer felt frightening. It felt like home. And Samuel, without ever speaking the words aloud, understood that Lily had found more than safety in him. She had found family. Margaret's recovery unfolded slowly, like the steady unfurling of a flower that had endured a harsh season. Each morning she woke with a bit more strength, her steps becoming surer as she moved through the home that had been lovingly restored for her. Though pain lingered in the bruised places of her body, it no longer carried the weight of solitude. She was surrounded by people who treated her well-being as a shared responsibility. One afternoon, while the sun drifted across the wooden floor in warm golden stripes, Margaret stood by the window watching Lily play outside. The child was laughing with Ethan as they searched for smooth stones near the path. Mason and Rowdy were repairing a loose board on the fence, their familiar grumbling softened by the contented rhythm of daily life. And Samuel, the steady heart of it all, was sorting through supplies for the next round of maintenance he insisted on completing. A soft emotion rose in Margaret's chest as she observed them, a blend of gratitude, wonder, and disbelief. She had spent long nights in the clinic struggling to understand how strangers had swept into her darkest moment and lifted her out of it with a compassion that felt almost unreal. She had expected judgment or distance, not such unwavering loyalty. These men, who lived on the open road with engines roaring beneath them, had brought quiet strength into the fragile corners of her life. She stepped outside, breathing in the scent of pine needles warming under the sun. Samuel noticed her and came to stand near her, offering the kind of respectful presence that never felt intrusive. She thanked him with a gentle smile, and he simply nodded, as though reminding her that gratitude was unnecessary between people bound by something deeper than obligation. But Margaret needed to speak her heart. She gathered her hands together, steadying her voice as she told him how she had spent her life believing that people revealed themselves most clearly in moments of hardship. In those moments, she continued, kindness shone brighter than fear. She explained that she once feared the world would take everything from her, yet she now understood that it could also give back in unexpected ways. Samuel responded with a quiet expression, softened by humility. He had never seen his actions as heroic, only necessary. Lily had needed them, and that was enough. But Margaret wanted him to know that he had restored more than a home. He had restored her sense of belonging in a world she had thought too harsh for gentle souls. As the afternoon stretched on, the riders gathered around the porch, sharing stories about old highways and forgotten roadside diners. Margaret listened, amused by their playful banter, touched by the way they treated Lily as though she were the youngest member of their sprawling family. She felt an unfamiliar lightness settle into her heart, easing the fear she had carried since the night of the attack. Mrs. Delaney joined them near sunset, her warm laugh blending with the murmured voices of the men. She remarked quietly that family did not always come from shared blood, but from shared burdens. Margaret nodded, understanding fully. The Brotherhood had carried her burden without hesitation, and in doing so, had woven themselves into the fabric of her life. As the sky turned pink and gold, Samuel stepped onto the porch with Lily cradled on his hip. She rested her head on his shoulder, her arms wrapped around him with a sense of absolute security. The sight pulled gently at Margaret's heart, filling her with a profound recognition. These men were no longer strangers. They were protectors, companions, and perhaps something even more enduring. They were family, bound not by circumstance alone, but by the love and kindness that had risen from the ashes of fear. Autumn crept gently through the forest, coloring the treetops with soft gold and fading amber. The cabin sat beneath the shifting canopy like a quiet heartbeat, steady and warm. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm for Margaret and Lily, a rhythm shaped by healing moments and the presence of people who had stepped into their lives with unexpected devotion. And with each passing day, Samuel found himself drawn into that rhythm as though fate had always intended him to be part of it. He spent many mornings on the porch, seated in an old wooden chair that Margaret had repaired during her recovery. She had insisted on mending it herself, saying that a home carried the imprint of every loving hand that shaped it. Samuel often watched the forest breathe around them while sipping warm coffee, listening to the sounds of a life slowly restored. Lily would join him with her small tin cup, swinging her feet lightly as she recounted the quiet adventures of her day. Samuel felt something changing inside him, something subtle yet undeniable, a gentle thawing, a loosening of the tight knots grief had tied around his heart years earlier. When his daughter passed, he had convinced himself that fatherhood was a chapter life had sealed forever. He had wandered from town to town with the Brotherhood, searching for purpose along long stretches of highway, but rarely finding the peace he longed for. Yet here, in the soft glow of the forest mornings, peace came to him without fanfare. It arrived in the way Lily slipped her hand into his during their walks. It appeared in the way Margaret looked at him with quiet gratitude, a look that carried both understanding and acknowledgement of the space he had opened for her and her child. It settled in his chest whenever the Brotherhood gathered at the cabin, their laughter blending with the rustling leaves while Lily handed them cups of cider she insisted on serving herself. Evenings carried their own gentle magic. Fireflies floated through the dusk, weaving soft trails of light above the grass. Lily often curled up beside Samuel on the porch steps, resting her head on his shoulder. Margaret would sit nearby, her hands busy carving small wooden tokens she planned to sell at the market. Ethan cleaned his tools while telling stories that made Lily giggle, and the rest of the riders joined without hesitation, filling the night with warmth and belonging. One evening, as the final traces of daylight faded, Samuel felt a wave of realization wash over him. He watched Lily chase the fireflies with playful delight, her laughter rising like a small lantern against the deepening sky. He saw Margaret standing by the door, her face touched by gratitude so profound it softened the shadows of her past. And for the first time in years, Samuel understood that the hollow space inside him was no longer empty. It had been quietly filled by the simple, unassuming grace of loving others again. He had set out that morning weeks earlier, as a man on a road with no destination, carrying memories he thought he would bear alone forever. Yet somewhere along the dusty stretch of highway, life had placed a frightened child in his path, a child whose courage had brought him back to himself. The Brotherhood sensed this shift as well. They teased him gently, though their smiles carried a deep respect. They knew the road had shaped them, but moments like these reminded them why they rode in the first place. Not for the noise or the freedom, but for the chance to be the kind of men who stepped forward when the world called for kindness. As the stars appeared above the treetops, Samuel rested his hand on Lily's small shoulder. She looked up at him, her expression calm, her trust absolute. Margaret joined them, settling beside Samuel with a quiet contentment. The night wrapped around the three of them with a tenderness that felt like a promise. Samuel breathed deeply, letting the cool air settle into his lungs. He had saved them in a moment of desperation, but he knew now that they had saved him in ways he never expected. They had brought meaning back into his days, softened the ache of old losses, and shown him that family did not need to be born from blood. It could form from courage, compassion, and the gentle meeting of wounded hearts. Before the fireflies disappeared into the night, Samuel whispered a silent vow to continue standing beside them, wherever the road ahead might lead. And for those who heard this story, there was a simple lesson resting in its heart. Sometimes the family we find is the one destiny sends our way when we least expect it. Sometimes healing arrives in the form of a frightened child running toward help, or a quiet man brave enough to stop. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in grace, kindness, and second chances, let your presence be known. Your voice may be the light someone else needs tonight.